Welcome everyone in the room and those of you listening in here to this Demos research seminar. Not a very special guest, who's actually the main speaker today. Who's you, Evie? Evie Papada is the human geographer at the School of Geography and Sustainable Development in the UK. And hopefully to be affiliated on the long run with Demos, if everything's pronounced correctly. See? No jinxing. So the program for today is that Evie will start out with a presentation, and then I already read the paper in advance and some comments and points for discussion, and then we'll open the floor to anyone interested both here and online who wants to join me. Yeah,
Okay, thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. My presentation is centered around EU policies on asylum and migration, and the geographical focus is the Greek Aegean islands, or Greece in general. And I'm gonna go through the following topics. So I'm going to take you through, it's a bit of a chronicle from 2010 to the present. It's kind of long. I might have to maybe skip some parts of it because the actual paper is very much at the end. Let's see. But it kind of also follows my career a little bit from working with the UNHCR and kind of jumping into research and doing the collaborative project and then my PhD and all of that. So let's see how it goes and how much I can cover in the time. So given its location at the territorial edges of the EU, Greece had long been attracting the focus of the EU Commission in relation to its overall goals in the management of asylum and migration. So at the end of the previous decade, saw very rapid developments in the country's asylum and border management policies. We had the 2010 Greece Migration Management Plan, and in that we had the Greece transposed for the first time into its national legislation the Return Directive, so an EU directive, and we had the launch of the first independent asylum service, which was a big thing. So until then, the refugee determination procedures were run by the Greek police. The second key development was the introduction of what was then called the first reception service. And this was the first attempt to consolidate procedural rules and practices in the land and sea borders, aiming at a bureaucratic but also physical and digital capture of those entering through the country's external borders. So we had the first Eurodac machines being introduced, or were bought by the police, and people were being detained and so on. At the time, the authorities estimated that about 90,000 people were arriving in what they call irregular month. So the modernization of the Greek asylum and migration management was financially and politically sponsored by the EU and assisted in the provision of technical expertise from the UN Refugee Agency and the European Asylum Support Office, and which had then only been recently established to support the efforts towards the goal of a common European asylum system. I joined the UNHCR in 2010 in Athens as a liaison to the Ministry of Health. At the time, there was no Ministry of Migration to provide expertise on how to build an accommodation and referral system. So from 2011, when the new independent asylum service was launched, until about 2014, it was perhaps one of the better, if you like, equipped asylum services in Europe, because it was staffed by UNHCR trained human rights lawyers, and suddenly the dismal 0.2% recognition rates jumped up a lot higher. At the same time, it was only the Athens office the asylum service that was in operation. The regional offices were not operating, so still the access to asylum remained a problem for quite a long time. This is I've just put here in the picture. You can see the pink card, which was what the police used to issue, and then it was in 2015 replaced by this card. Is the asylum card, and there's loads of stories about these pink cards, how difficult it was to get them, how difficult it was to replace them when they were replace them when they were lost, and so on. So I found this actually on the internet, so you know, hopefully it's okay. So the other thing around this time was we had you know, Greece's economic hardships. Yeah, so also affecting the politics of migration. So we had a very harsh introduction of very harsh austerity measures. We had, you know, the Golden Dawn neo-Nazi party winning almost 7% of the vote. And during these years, we had a lot of harassment on the streets, arrests, stop and searches, even murders in the streets of Athens. And the police launched this operation called the Xenios Zeus, which between August and December in 2012 made over 80,000 arrests, and kind of continued with government continued with very harsh deterrence measures in border areas, particularly Nevros, as you can see in this slide. The map fixtures the augmentation of capacity removal centers. So in 2013, we also had the opening of the first reception center up in Evros on the corner there in the Turkish border. And Frontex, you know, introducing new operations both in land and sea. And in response to this growing racist violence, in the streets of Athens, the UNHCR, in collaboration with the Greek National Center for Human Rights, launched this racist violence recording network. It's managed to bring a little bit of a little bit more balanced, if you like, dialogue in the media about what was going on. Because at the time there was a very big anti-migrant sentiment and discourse pushed by the mainstream media. Okay, so this is as a kind of a background, and this is a time when I stopped working also with the UN and I started working, you know, I started doing the research project I'm going to talk about. Now, this is the so-called refugee crisis period, and in the picture you can see which was indeed actually, you know, a crisis for the European border regime. And in the picture you can see Mr. Avramopoulos, the then EU Commissioner for Migration, on the island of Lesbos, speaking to the Greek and Portuguese coast guards, and he then proceeded to the reception and identification center of Moria camp, maybe some of you might be familiar with, where he officially launched it as a hotspot. We'll talk about that hotspot in a minute. But his message during that visit was that you know, this was a European problem, and Europe was there to support Greece in its management efforts. So this was the political message, if you like. Now, this map kind of depicts the principal migration journeys during that time, you know, but it also kind of depicts the ways in which journeys become registered in the imaginaries of policymakers as unidirectional and unproblematized in relation to the complexities that they generate. At that point in 2015, the message communicated by political elites in the European Commission, but also many member states leaders, was that migration movements crossing the Turkish coastline into the Aegean Sea constituted an exceptionary flow that demanded a robust and collective response. So we had, you know, in the beginning we had, you know, an increasing death toll in the Mediterranean, 800 people dying in the shipwreck near the island Lampedusa, and that had triggered the reflexes of the Commission, which published the European Agenda on Migration in May 2016, aiming at tackling what was then presented as a humanitarian crisis, but also as a crisis for the common European asylum system, because because asylum applications were increasing substantially. So the centerpiece of this of this policy document was the hotspot approach for managing exceptional flows, what they call it. A year later, in March 2016, they launched the EU Take Statement that some of you may be familiar with, and that was a game changer. We'll talk about that in a minute as well. So the period between May 2015 and March 26 was dubbed by the then Minister of Migration as the Age of Innocence, commenting on the short-lived appetite for hospitality and solidarity shown by the European governments to the refugees. Now let me go into a little bit more into the hotspot approach. I'll come back to this map. So what is a hotspot? This is the definition given by the EC. A hotspot is characterized by specific and disproportionate migratory pressure consisting of mixed migratory flows, which are largely linked to smuggling of migrants, and where the member states consent might request support and assistance to better cope with migratory pressure. In principle, an external border section should be considered to be a hotspot for the limited period of time during which the emergency or crisis situation subsists. Now, as you can see in this graph put together by the UN refugee agencies, the vast majority of the people crossing into the Aegean between January and December 2015 are from in policy language we call refugee producing countries, as in their nationalities that had a very strong asylum claim, or people with very strong asylum claims. So not very much a mixed migration at all, mixed flows at all. So these are the 5 geographical areas where they built those hotspots. There were physical infrastructure. So it was Lesbos, Chios, Samos, Leros, and Kos. And then there were also 5 in Italy. So 10. Now, this kind of vague description that the European Commission gave was not very satisfying. So when we went to do our fieldwork there, we came to find out what this hotspot approach really is and what this hotspots really do. Now, this is a more detailed look at what a hotspot does. Okay, so on the left side, you can see the function of a hotspot, and on the right, the kind of responsibilities. So did these functions exist before in the original first reception centers with hotspots replaced? Some of them did, not most of them, not to the same kind of extent and complication. But I think what is kind of really eye-catching here is the international operation. Okay, so this is the lines of authority, if you like, to who the responsibility lies with are blurred. For example, the Greek Asylum Service had the overall responsibility for asylum claims in the mainland, but not on these 5 islands, and so on. So this is also a very fine example of what we, in my research, collaborate, called the EU territorialization. So you have, for the first time, EU agencies on the territorial limits of a nation state making effectively decisions on asylum claims and other kind of decisions, processes that would normally fall under national jurisdiction. Right. Okay, so we were obviously not the only ones researching this hotspot approach, but some of the work is showcased in a special issue edited in the Journal Environment and Planning, Society and Space. So the hotspot has been analyzed in relation to the hierarchies of mobility it creates and the governance logics that underpin it. It has been theorized in relation to the ad hoc and pop-up mode of governance it introduces into the management of asylum and migration. In relation to the care and control practices that it generates, while at the same time negating the territorial presence of asylum seekers into the EU by distancing them sociopolitically. The way in which it continues to produce this carceral logic, but without necessarily containing refugees in a closed space. like a detention center. And finally, that despite this intensification of mobility control, these practices of resistance were still possible. And indeed, we've had many examples, in the past 5 years of refugees organizing to demand their rights and better living conditions and so on. I have a couple of copies of these books, but I left them in the hotel, but I will bring them tomorrow and you can have them here. Right, so that's the hotspots. Now, moving on to the EU-Turkey deal. Moving on, another key event has been the signing of the EU-Turkey deal. It is based on this fiction that Turkey is a safe third country for refugees and asylum seekers, and it rests on this mechanism of exchange whereby for every Syrian that enters through the Greek Aegean islands, but only those islands, not if it enters through Evros, another one is returned to Turkey. In addition, the deal stipulates that all those who enter the Greek Aegean islands are served with an automatic rejection and deportation order, because, again, Turkey is a safe country for them. So this is this type of outsourcing EU's asylum obligations to neighboring countries is known as the externalization of borders and asylum. Now, in order to implement the deal, in other words, to make the return of potential asylum seekers legal, because just sending them back without a due process would constitute refoulement. The Greek government voted in Law 4375, which was the transposition of the EU Directive on Asylum Procedures. The law makes use of a clause that allows for the temporary introduction of the so-called fast-track border procedures, which are meant to examine the admissibility of one's asylum claim. So admissibility refers to whether the asylum application is the responsibility of the country in which it's being launched or another country, in this case, Turkey. So basically, when you enter the Aegean Islands now, after March 16, and the hotspot, which is the registration center, and you say you want to apply for asylum, you're not going to get an interview for asylum, but you're going to get an interview for admissibility. And as a direct result, many asylum seekers have not been receiving a fair hearing of the case, given that admissibility procedures don't examine reasons for persecution. They just examine which country is responsible. They were further accompanied by an order of geographical restriction, obliging those arriving on Greek islands to remain there for the duration of the process. But, there's a but, exempt from those fast-track border procedures were those who were found to fulfill one or more of the 5 vulnerability criteria set on that Greek law. So if you were pregnant, unaccompanied minor, suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, you're a victim of torture, and one more that I can't remember. So if you were found to be vulnerable, you would go through the admissibility procedure, but you would not go through the admissibility procedure. You would instead jump over to the regular asylum procedure. Now, this is what it's really bad here, but this is what the asylum procedures looked after the EU-Turkey agreement. I mean, it was incredibly difficult for lawyers to explain this to asylum seekers. I mean, it's very difficult, for me to understand. The kind of steps that you had to take at the time. This was vulnerability. So if you were basically designated vulnerability, you would jump all these things on the bottom and just go straight into the regular asylum procedure, which was a fairer procedure. And it was especially important for Syrians, because Syrians were by default going to be sent back to Turkey because of the agreement. So now, so given this exemption, vulnerability assessment soon became important for the outcome of the asylum process and a complementary screening tool for operationalizing the agreement. Now, politically, the vulnerability assessments were instrumentalized by authorities at the time to legitimize the new border procedures, which had much lower standards, for asylum seekers, and because they had to ensure that Greece appears as a safe country that respects human rights, and vulnerability assessments can say, yes, we respect human rights. So initially it was immigration caseworkers from the European Asylum Support Office who would undertake the assessments, and then it was also, but they would, say that really no one was vulnerable, because if they said that they were vulnerable, then they would jeopardize the agreement, whose implementation was very much part of their mission statement and the reason why they were there in the hotspot in the first place. So deliberations on vulnerability was also made by medical personnel and immigration case officers and relied mostly on appearances, so on the visible appearance of asylum seekers, or visible scars, pregnancies, and so on. But also perceptions regarding the geographical origin of the vulnerability were really important. So if you had acquired your vulnerability before you arrived in Greece, then that was okay. But if you acquired it in Moria in these conditions, then you weren't vulnerable. So this is a poem that I found written in the Legal Center of Lesbos, written by Ted Franco, a Congolese asylum seeker, and which kind of really summarizes very well the meaning of vulnerability for people at the time, and the extent to which inevitably it became a desirable condition, because unless you proved that you were vulnerable, there was no way you could basically get into the regular asylum procedure. Okay, now I wanted to just maybe go through the paper, just a few points if I have the time. Yeah. Now, in the summer of 2020, I was invited by some colleagues to contribute to a special issue for the Journal of Greek Modern Studies on the topic of legacies of 1922, building and rebuilding borders, identity, and belonging since the Greco-Turkish War and Population Exchange. So this is 100 years from the Asia Minor catastrophe to today, and so this article interlaces the two migration events, the population exchange of 1923 with the recent refugee crisis, and the kind of point is to underscore the role of vulnerability with regards to the notion of vulnerability with regards to the contemporary refugee policies. And it argues that the forced 1922 exchange of populations and the current EU-Turkey agreement shape the Aegean as a borderscape of change and displacement. This borderscape is further characterized by what I identify as a moral economy of vulnerability. In other words, the bringing together of, on the one hand, moral values indicating our sentiments towards the vulnerable refugee, and on the other, the prevailing economic discourses in a given social context. So vulnerability economies, as I define as the differential value and treatment attributed to those seeking protection on account of their ascribed or perceived vulnerability. In this article, I explain first how the legal mechanisms put in place for both exchanges led to politically induced vulnerabilities. So while we mostly find out about the 1922 refugee experiences through existing testimonies, the later exchange, the EU-Turkey deal, produced vulnerabilities by way of downgrading the asylum procedures, as I explained before. I then go on to discuss the different strategies for ordering and prioritizing life and the needs of refugees in these two periods, focusing mostly on the contemporary story. And I conceptualize this as the denial of urgency of the migrant body in waiting, so referring to the refugees who are waiting in Moria and not the other reception centers. A number of migration scholars, especially anthropologists, have approached this migrant waiting from an analytical perspective in order to talk about the temporalities of migration generally, but also waiting as a social phenomenon. By conceptualizing waiting as the denial of urgency, I'm trying to shed light into the ways in which migrants are made to compete for a place in an evacuation list, for instance, and their immediate and urgent needs to leave the camp and the island become subject to financial considerations, culminating into specific economies of prioritization. The argument here is that economies of prioritization and distribution prey on migrants' ability to wait endlessly, sucking up their human vitality, making them more depressed and anxious. I then briefly draw on testimonies of Greek refugees who forcibly left the cities and villages of Asia Minor back then to find a new home in Greece and draw parallels with the more recent experiences of displacement. As they also, back then, they also fell prey to financial exploitation and abandonment by authorities. In the case of 1922 displacement, these vulnerabilities helped precarize and informalize the labor of refugees, and hence offered cheap labor as a source of value to the national economy. The vulnerability of the post-2015 asylum seekers, on the other hand, has produced a rentier value to a carceral humanitarianism that swallows EU financial resources while holding refugees in a state of legal precarity. and making them reliant on this rentier economy. In the final section of this article, I tried to make a connection between the financial and political circumstances, okay, of the country in both historical periods, and discuss how the management of these refugee asylum-seeking populations became entangled with this larger process of normalization. So, in 1922, Greece was a very new established state, and in grave need to build its economy. In 2015 onwards, Greece returns to this rhetoric of the financial crisis is over, and it's about time things become normal, and Greece has to behave like a normal country. So this is very much reflected in the way Greece is now pushed to take over the financial management of humanitarian aid. It was the EU and the UNHCR basically who was doing it through, the introduction of a STIA housing scheme and the cash assistance program. And also, you get also asylum seekers to behave like normal people because they have cards like the rest of us and so on. So vulnerability thinking is also very much present in the funding conditionalities of the EU aid programs, etc., etc. Just to close with two more words, this is the new Asylum and Migration Pact. I'm now in 2021, I think, still commenting on the paper. And I just wanted to show you that how many of these experimentations we saw during the hotspot approach are now becoming basically very much mainstream EU policy. The new Asylum and Migration Pact that is being discussed in the Parliament is arguing for, or is calling for new screening procedures. Health checks are becoming mandatory. There wasn't anything like that before. And generally, there is a lot of it's kind of generalizes the hotspot approach, and also it reinforces a more kind of the digital capacities of the migration management and AI technologies. And my very last slide is from my visit 2 weeks ago in Greece at the Ministry of Migration, where I had a chat with the head of the office of the minister about their digitalization of the migration management, and he took me to this high security room. He was very proud that he was showing me this what they call the situation room, where they basically evicted everyone from the previous camps in Greece, and they made new very high security camps, and they have cameras that they control from the office in Athens, and so it's very, very difficult for people who live in these camps, who are not very many now because everyone gets pushed back, to do anything. So this is what they call closed controlled access centers, and are there, the continuation, if you like, of the hotspots. And I don't know what, we will see in the future, but I was very much taken aback from the pride with which this person had when he was showing me this picture. Anyway, thank you very much. That was all for me. And sorry that took so long.
No, it's very fine. Thank you.